The moon hung low over the Mississippi Delta that night, casting an eerie light over the winding dirt roads. A slow, distant breeze whispered through the trees, and the air felt thick, almost alive. There was a hum, something intangible that seemed to vibrate from the very earth beneath their feet. It was midnight. A small town in Mississippi, barely more than a few scattered homes and a tavern, was the setting for a night that would become legendary, if not entirely understood. Three men, ordinary musicians, hardened by years of playing in smoky bars and juke joints, had traveled far to see something extraordinary. They had heard the stories, heard the whispers of a man named Robert Johnson. They had heard the rumors of his music, his haunting, otherworldly sound that could send shivers down your spine. But more than that, they had heard the legend, the one that spoke of a man who had made a deal with the devil, right at a crossroads. Tonight, they would bear witness to the myth. As they approached the small tavern, the sound of a guitar reached their ears, sharp and hypnotic. There was a restless energy in the air, as if the very fabric of reality had been stretched thin. The sound, raw and unsettling, seemed to draw them in, like a moth to a flame. The tavern was filled with smoke and the low murmur of voices. It was dimly lit, with the flickering light of lanterns casting long shadows across the room. The atmosphere was heavy, charged with anticipation. Every eye was on the small stage where Robert Johnson sat with his guitar, his fingers moving with unnatural precision. His presence was magnetic. He wasn't just playing music, he was summoning something. The three men stood at the back, watching him intently, unsure of what to expect. They had heard stories of his talents, but there was something about seeing him in person, hearing his music live, that felt different. The room seemed to pulse with each note he played, as though the very air had changed. There was a silence that enveloped the crowd, the kind of silence that you feel in your bones. And it wasn't just the music. It was the sensation that something was on the verge of happening, something that had always been there but had never fully revealed itself until now. The man closest to the stage, the one who had heard the most stories, felt a chill creep up his spine. He couldn't explain it, but something was off. He had seen many performances in his life, but nothing like this. The guitar seemed to have a life of its own, its strings ringing out with an eerie resonance. It wasn't just a man playing. It felt like the very essence of the music was coming from somewhere darker, deeper than the soul of a single person. And then it happened. In the dim light at the edge of the stage, a figure emerged. Tall, cloaked in shadow, his face hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat. The figure stood motionless, watching Johnson as he played. For a split second, the crowd seemed to collectively hold its breath. The air grew colder, heavier. It was as if the room itself was holding its breath, waiting. The men at the back of the room stiffened. There was a strange tension in the air. It was subtle at first, almost imperceptible. But as Robert Johnson continued to play, it grew. The figure in the shadows didn't move, didn't speak. But the men felt his presence, like an invisible force pushing against them. One of the men looked to the others, his eyes wide with disbelief. He wasn't sure if it was the music or the figure in the shadows, but something was happening, something that they couldn't understand. His heart began to race, his palms sweating. He didn't want to look again, didn't want to acknowledge the figure standing at the edge of the stage. But his gaze was drawn to it, as if an invisible force had taken hold of his mind. The music swirled in the air, twisting and turning, creating a web of sound that pulled at their very souls. It was hypnotic. And then, as if on cue, Robert Johnson's eyes flicked up. For a brief moment, his gaze met the man's. Intense, cold, distant. There was something in that look, something that made his blood run cold. The man's thoughts raced. Was this what they had heard about? Was this the moment when the story of the crossroads, of the deal with the devil, was coming true? And then, as quickly as it had appeared, the figure in the shadows was gone. vanished without a trace, leaving behind only the faintest trace of coldness in the air. But it didn't feel like just an illusion. It felt real, too real to ignore. The music didn't stop. Robert Johnson's fingers moved with eerie precision, gliding over the strings like an extension of his very soul. The haunting sound of his guitar seemed to fill every corner of the room, weaving in and out of the air like smoke. His playing was mesmerizing. Each note seemed to carry a weight, as if the music itself was an entity with its own intentions. The three men, still standing at the back of the room, couldn't shake the feeling that they had witnessed something unnatural. They looked at each other, silently communicating a shared sense of unease. The figure in the shadows, the presence that seemed to loom over them, was gone, but its weight remained. It was as if the room itself had changed, as though the very fabric of reality had been stretched and pulled at the edges. One of the men, the oldest of the group, couldn't shake the feeling that they had stumbled upon something far darker than they had anticipated. His hands shook slightly as he clutched the edge of the wooden table. He had spent years playing music, listening to the greats of the blues, but nothing had ever made him feel like this. This wasn't just talent, it was something else, something beyond the realm of explanation. He had heard the stories, of course. Everyone in the Delta had heard them, the tales of Robert Johnson's sudden, inexplicable mastery of the guitar. They had heard about the crossroads, about the pact he had supposedly made with the devil. But until tonight, he had always dismissed those stories as just that, stories. Now, standing in the dimly lit room, watching Johnson play, he wasn't so sure. The others felt the same way. None of them could quite put it into words, but they all knew they had witnessed something out of the ordinary. They had seen that shadowy figure at the edge of the stage. They had felt the coldness in the air. They had felt the pull of something darker, something not of this world, hanging just beyond the edge of their understanding. And then, without warning, Robert Johnson's guitar screeched to a sudden halt. The music stopped. For a brief moment, everything was silent. It was as though the entire room held its breath, waiting for something to happen. The crowd seemed to shift uncomfortably, as if they too were sensing the tension in the air. No one moved, no one spoke. Even the men at the back of the room stood frozen, their eyes glued to the stage. And then Robert Johnson stood up. His face, always partially obscured by the brim of his hat, was now fully visible. His eyes, dark, intense and impossibly cold, scanned the room, locking onto each person one by one. When his gaze fell on the three men at the back, it lingered just a moment longer. In that instant, it felt as if the air itself had thickened. The weight of his gaze seemed to crush down on them. It was as though he could see straight into their souls, stripping away all pretense, all the layers of their identity. He knew them. He knew their fear, their doubt, their curiosity. And then, just as suddenly as it had come, the moment passed. Robert Johnson turned and walked toward the back of the room, disappearing into the shadows. The crowd seemed to breathe again, but the men, still paralyzed by the experience, didn't move. They could still feel his presence, even though he was gone. The oldest man finally spoke, his voice trembling slightly. Did you see that?" he asked, his words barely above a whisper. The other two nodded, their faces pale. They couldn't speak. There was nothing to say. They had all seen the same thing. They had all felt it. And now, as the minutes passed in heavy silence, they began to realize something else. They were no longer sure if they had witnessed a man's performance or if they had seen something far darker, something supernatural. A few moments later, Robert Johnson returned to the stage, the same hypnotic melody beginning once more. But this time, something was different. The crowd, which had been mesmerized by his playing earlier, now seemed oddly distant. Their faces were blank, their eyes wide but unseeing, as though they were no longer present in the room with the rest of the world. The three men exchanged uneasy glances. They had all heard stories of how time could stand still at the crossroads, how the devil could make a deal that was not of this world. But now they were starting to wonder, was this real? Or had their minds been twisted by something beyond their control? One of the men, the youngest, tried to shake off the uneasy feeling in his chest. He'd always been the skeptic, but the longer he stood there, the more he realized that he wasn't so sure anymore. Is this real? He asked, his voice shaking. But there was no answer. The night seemed to stretch on endlessly. The three men stood in the back of the room, their eyes fixed on Robert Johnson, who was now lost in his music, as if the guitar had become an extension of himself. The crowd was strangely still, unmoving, almost lifeless. It was as if they had been hypnotized by the sound, pulled into a trance they couldn't break free from. The youngest of the three men, unable to tear his eyes away from Johnson, felt his legs begin to weaken. A dizziness washed over him, a heaviness in his chest that seemed to rise with every note the guitarist played. He had heard rumors before, had laughed them off, about Robert Johnson making a deal with the devil, selling his soul at the crossroads. But never had he felt the truth of those rumors, the reality of that myth pressing down on him like this. He stumbled slightly, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The older man next to him, the one who had been the most skeptical of them all, reached out a hand to steady him. "You all right?" he asked, his voice low, but there was a tremor in it now, a doubt that hadn't been there before. I don't know," the young man replied, his voice cracking. It's like it's not even him playing anymore, like he's something else. It's not just a man with a guitar." The words hung in the air between them, and neither of the older men had an answer. They all felt it, the oppressive force, the unnatural presence, the pull of the music that seemed to transcend human comprehension. They had been in the presence of great musicians before, but this was something far beyond what they had ever encountered. Suddenly, the youngest man's eyes flicked to the side. There once again was the figure in the shadows. It was hard to tell if he had never truly left, or if he had returned. But now, the figure stood even closer to the stage, watching Robert Johnson with an intensity that felt almost suffocating. The young man's heart began to race again, his pulse quickening. He couldn't see the face of the figure, no one could, but it didn't matter. The presence was undeniable. The air had thickened again, pressing in on him from all sides. He felt as though the room had closed in, that the walls were moving in toward him, that there was no way out. "Do you see him?" he whispered urgently, his voice barely audible. The two older men turned their heads, their eyes scanning the shadows. For a moment there was nothing, just the dim flicker of lanterns and the hypnotic melody of the guitar. But then there he was, again. The figure, the tall man in black, standing still as ever, his form blending into the shadows as though he were one with the darkness itself. There was no mistaking it now. The three men exchanged uneasy glances. They knew the rumors, the stories that said the devil himself had come to collect the soul of Robert Johnson. But no one had ever been able to confirm them. Not until now. As Robert Johnson continued to play, his fingers moving in intricate patterns that seemed to flow without effort, the figure in the shadows began to move. Slowly, deliberately, he stepped toward the stage, his movements unnaturally smooth, as if he were gliding. The three men couldn't tear their eyes away. The figure stopped just before the stage, standing at the edge of the shadows, waiting. Robert Johnson's gaze never wavered, still focused on the strings of his guitar, but the tension in the room thickened once again. It was as if the entire world had come to a standstill, as if everyone in that room was caught in the grip of something far greater than they could comprehend. The youngest man reached out to his friends, his hand trembling. Do you think it's really him, the devil?" The older man shook his head, but his expression was far from confident. "I don't know, but something's not right. This feels different. It's like we're not just witnessing a performance. It's like we're part of something bigger." The figure in the shadows moved again, and this time it seemed to draw closer to the edge of the stage. The men could hear the faint sound of footsteps, like the softest whisper of movement. The crowd around them seemed oblivious to the presence of the figure, lost in the trance of Johnson's playing. But to the three men, the figure's presence felt like a presence that could not be ignored. It loomed larger with every passing second, growing more and more real. And then, as the final note of Robert Johnson's song hung in the air, something strange happened. The figure, standing so still, began to move toward the stage. Slowly, slowly, he reached for something. The men watched, wide-eyed, as the figure extended a hand toward the guitarist. Robert Johnson's eyes finally lifted from the guitar, his gaze meeting the figures in the shadows. The air seemed to crackle with energy, with electricity. For a long, painful moment, there was silence. Absolute silence. The music had stopped, and in its place, the room was filled with something far darker, far more potent. A presence that could only be described as unnatural. Then, without warning, Robert Johnson's hand dropped from the guitar. He stood up, his body suddenly rigid, his eyes wide, but not with fear. No, not fear. The older men could see it now. There was a strange sense of calm, of acceptance in his eyes, as if he had been waiting for this moment his entire life. And in that moment, the three men realized Robert Johnson had made a choice. He had made a deal. And it was a deal that would change everything. The figure stepped forward. The moment stretched on endlessly, the silence deafening, punctuated only by the faint echo of Robert Johnson's final chord hanging in the air. Then something happened that none of them could have predicted. Robert Johnson, as though in a trance, slowly rose from his seat. His fingers, still twitching as if they could feel the guitar beneath them, moved toward the figure in the shadows. The three men watched in disbelief as Johnson approached the figure, his expression eerily calm. There was no fear, no sign of hesitation, only a deep, resolute acceptance. The figure, tall, cloaked in shadow, and almost indistinguishable from the dark corners of the room, held out a hand. The men at the back of the room held their breath, their hearts pounding in their chests. They could feel something in the air, something heavy, something ancient. It was as though the room itself was about to tear apart. And then Robert Johnson did something that seemed impossible. He reached out and took the figure's hand. It was as if the world around them had stopped. The room fell silent. Even the air itself held its breath. The men could feel their hearts racing, each thump reverberating through their bodies. They could no longer see the figure's face, but they could feel the exchange, the pact being sealed in that one moment. There was something deeply unsettling about it, a feeling that would remain with them for the rest of their lives. The room seemed to darken even further, the flickering lanterns casting long, unsettling shadows on the walls. The music that had once flowed so effortlessly from Robert Johnson's guitar now seemed to echo in the silence, an eerie reminder of what had just occurred. The three men, paralyzed by the sight, felt a sudden coldness grip their bones. The figure in the shadows, now in full view, took a step back, vanishing as if it had never been there at all. For a moment, no one moved. The crowd, which had once been mesmerized by Robert Johnson's playing, seemed unaware of what had just transpired. The men at the back, however, were not so fortunate. They had witnessed something they could never forget. The air around them buzzed with energy, crackling with an intensity that they could not explain. The oldest man, unable to contain his fear any longer, took a step back, his voice trembling. "Did you see that?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. The youngest of the group, eyes wide with terror, nodded without saying a word. His mind was racing, his heart still pounding in his chest. What just happened?" he whispered hoarsely. The second man, still staring at the empty stage where the figure had stood, couldn't speak. There were no words that could explain what they had just witnessed. They had seen something otherworldly, something that defied logic, reason, and every story they had ever heard. Robert Johnson, standing alone in the dim light, turned back to his guitar. He didn't look at the crowd, didn't look at the men. His fingers once again began to move over the strings. The haunting melody filled the room again, but this time it was different. It was deeper, darker. As the haunting melody poured from Robert Johnson's guitar, something in the air shifted. The tension that had gripped the room loosened slightly, but the men could feel that the atmosphere was still charged. It wasn't the same music they had heard before. The sound felt heavier, more intense, as though it carried with it a weight that threatened to crush the listener. One of the men, still trembling from the experience, looked around the room. The other patrons seemed oblivious to the unnatural energy that had just filled the room. They continued to clap and cheer, oblivious to the pact they had just witnessed. But for the three men, the events of the night would never leave them. They had seen something that defied every explanation, something that no one else could understand. The youngest man, feeling a mixture of dread and disbelief, turned to the others. "We have to leave," he whispered urgently. "We can't stay here. This isn't right." The older man nodded slowly, his face pale. "I agree. I've seen many things in my life, but nothing like this. We've witnessed something beyond explanation." But before they could move, they heard a voice that seemed to echo through the very walls of the room, though no one else appeared to hear it. "It's too late," the voice said, soft but undeniable. It was Robert Johnson's voice, but it didn't sound like the man they had seen before. It was deep, almost unnatural, and it resonated in their very bones. "The deal has already been made." The three men froze. The voice had come from nowhere, yet it was everywhere, filling the room. The youngest man's heart skipped a beat. His legs felt weak, and his mind raced with questions. The room had become oppressive, the air thick with dread. The shadows seemed to stretch longer, darker. They could feel it, the weight of the pact that had just been made, the price that had been paid. Robert Johnson continued to play, his fingers moving over the strings with a speed and precision that no human hand could possibly achieve. The sound filled the room, but now it was almost unbearable. It felt as though the music was alive, as though the guitar was the source of the dark force in the room. The youngest man, unable to stand the overwhelming pressure any longer, turned to leave, but the door wouldn't open. It was as if something was holding it shut. He tried again, but it refused to budge. The coldness in the room deepened, and he could hear the faintest whispers, like voices from another world echoing through the walls. "Help!" he shouted, banging on the door. "Let us out!" But no one heard him, no one saw him. The silence in the room was suffocating. The air seemed thick, pressing against their chests, as though the very space around them was becoming dense and oppressive. The three men, still paralyzed by the intensity of what they had just witnessed, began to realize they were trapped, not just physically, but in something far deeper, something beyond their comprehension. They were caught in an event that transcended human understanding. They were part of a cosmic narrative, a tale of fate and choice, one far beyond their grasp. Robert Johnson stood before them, his presence absolutely commanding. His hands, which had been moving fluidly over the strings of his guitar moments before, were now still. He looked at them with an expression that was impossible to describe, neither anger nor malice, but there was something unsettling about his gaze. It wasn't the gaze of a man who still belonged to the world they knew. It was as if he had crossed over, as if he no longer truly belonged to the reality they inhabited. He had become something else. The music that had once filled the room now seemed like a distant memory, but its vibrations still echoed in the walls, lingering as though the sound itself had taken root in the space. It felt as though the music was a living thing, still alive in the room. The three men could feel it too, as though the sound were a tangible force, something that could touch them physically, like an electric current running through their bodies. Robert Johnson's eyes, those eyes, glowed in a way that was impossible to ignore. They were no longer just human eyes. They seemed to reflect something beyond sight, something deeper, something eternal. The men began to understand, deep in their hearts, that they were being watched by a presence that was no longer a mere man. They were standing in front of something far greater, older, and more powerful than anything they had ever encountered. Something from another realm. "You're not leaving." Robert Johnson's voice spoke again, this time with an unsettling calmness. It was almost as if he was simply confirming something that had already been written, something inevitable. "What's happened here cannot be undone." The voice wasn't just his. It felt like it was coming from something much larger, something older than anything they could comprehend. It resonated in their minds like a whisper from another world, something ancient and untouchable. It wasn't a man speaking anymore. It was something else, something that had possessed Robert Johnson, something that had made him a conduit for a power much greater than himself. The three men stood frozen, the weight of Robert Johnson's words sinking deep into their bones. They could feel it. An invisible force had taken hold of the room, and it wasn't letting go. The air around them seemed to thicken, the shadows in the corners of the room stretching and shifting. It was as if the room itself was folding into something else, something that was no longer of this world. It was as if time itself had begun to warp. Robert Johnson, still standing before them, raised his hands once more. His fingers, which had so effortlessly commanded the guitar, now moved in the air as though conducting the very atmosphere around them. The men could see the air vibrate with energy. It felt as though the walls themselves were alive, responding to his every gesture. There was a low hum, a buzz in the room, something electric, something unnatural. The shadows that had once seemed benign now seemed to creep closer, stretching toward them as though they had a life of their own. One of the men, the oldest of the three, felt his chest tighten. He could barely breathe. The room had become an oppressive place, a place that defied the laws of nature. He looked to the others, his eyes wide with a mix of fear and disbelief. He had heard the stories, the legends, but to experience it firsthand, to be standing in the presence of something so otherworldly, was too much. He couldn't comprehend it. The youngest of the men felt his knees weaken. He tried to speak, to say something, anything, but his voice failed him. His throat was dry, his words caught somewhere deep inside. He couldn't form a sentence. He looked around, desperate to find something, anything familiar. But everything had changed. The room was no longer a room. The space around them was warping, bending, stretching into something foreign, something they could not recognize. Time itself felt warped. The seconds felt like hours, and the hours felt like mere seconds. The second man, still gripping the edge of the table, tried to move, but his body wouldn't obey him. His legs were like stone, immovable. His eyes were locked on Robert Johnson, who had become more than a man in that moment. He was a symbol of something ancient, something powerful. The air around him seemed to crackle with energy, and the very earth beneath them seemed to tremble. "Do you see?" Robert Johnson's voice boomed, though it was still calm. "This is the price, the deal. The crossroads never forget." The words hit them like a shockwave. The youngest man finally found his voice cracking. "What have you done?" he gasped, unable to understand, unable to comprehend what was happening. What did you give up?" Robert Johnson's lips curved into a slow, almost imperceptible smile. "I gave up nothing," he said softly, his voice drifting into the air like smoke. "What I gave was nothing to me and everything to you." The shadows in the room deepened. The walls seemed to press inward, as though the very room was becoming smaller, tighter. They could feel the temperature drop. The cold seeped into their bones, and the whispers grew louder. They were not alone anymore. The room was filled with the whispers of forgotten voices, of souls long gone. The men could hear them faintly at first, like the softest of whispers. But soon the whispers grew louder. They were everywhere, echoing off the walls, their voices unintelligible but heavy with malice and sorrow. The figure that had stood in the shadows earlier, was it the devil? Was it something else? Seemed to materialize once more, standing just behind Robert Johnson, watching the three men. The figure's presence was unmistakable, and it radiated a power so dark, so ancient, that it almost suffocated the air. The men tried to move, but it was as if their limbs were locked in place by an unseen force. They could feel their hearts pounding in their chests, but no matter how hard they tried, their bodies refused to respond. "Please," the youngest man whispered, his voice barely audible, "let us go." Robert Johnson turned slowly, his eyes never leaving the men. His gaze was colder than ice. "You think you can leave? You think you can run from this? You are part of it now. You've seen the crossroads, you've seen the price, and now it's yours to pay." The figure behind him stepped forward, its shadow blending into the darkness of the room. The air grew colder still. The whispers grew louder, more desperate, as though something was trying to reach them, trying to pull them into the shadows. The oldest man, trembling, reached out a shaking hand. "We can't be part of this. This isn't real. It's just a story." Robert Johnson's eyes narrowed, and for a moment the room seemed to tremble with the force of his gaze. "Nothing is just a story," he said. "Nothing is just a legend. It's all real. And now you know it. Now you see it." The shadows closed in around them. The shadows thickened, stretching like long, creeping fingers, reaching out toward the three men. The air was colder than they had ever felt it. Every breath they took seemed to freeze in their chests. The very room around them seemed to pulse, alive with something far more powerful than they could ever comprehend. The whispers, once faint, were now deafening. They spoke in unison, in a language no one could understand, but their meaning was unmistakable. The whispers carried fear, pain, and a deep sorrow that seemed to reverberate through their very souls. It was as if they were hearing the voices of the long dead, trapped in eternal torment. The men could feel the weight of their existence pressing down on them. They were no longer mere observers in this strange and unsettling event. They were part of it, and they would never escape its grasp. The youngest man, his face pale and his legs trembling, finally broke the silence. "What do you want from us?" His voice was raw, desperate. "What have we done? We didn't ask for this. We're not part of your deal." Robert Johnson's gaze never wavered, though it seemed to pierce through the young man's very soul. "You think you haven't been part of it?" he asked softly, his voice laced with something ancient, something dark. "You think you haven't been walking this path from the very beginning?" The three men fell silent. They had heard the stories, the legends of Robert Johnson's pact at the crossroads, but now, standing before him, they realized the truth, that the crossroads were not just a place of meeting. They were a force, an inevitable part of the universe, an inescapable point of destiny. Robert Johnson was no longer just a man. He was a representation of the crossroads themselves. He was the one who had crossed the line, the one who had made the deal, and he was bound by it just as much as they were now. The shadows began to pulse in rhythm with the growing whispers. The figure that had stood behind Robert Johnson now seemed to solidify, its form becoming more defined, more real. The air grew dense, almost suffocating, and the three men could feel their hearts beating faster, each beat a reminder of how close they were to something they couldn't control. And then, without warning, the figure reached out, its long, bony fingers brushing against the youngest man's shoulder. The touch was cold, colder than anything he had ever felt, colder than death itself. The young man flinched, his body jerking away from the figure, but there was nowhere to run. The shadows enveloped him, wrapping themselves around him like a suffocating cloak. The air vibrated, and a deep, otherworldly growl rumbled from within the shadows. The figure didn't speak, but the message was clear. It wasn't just Robert Johnson they had to answer to. It was the force that had claimed him, that had claimed the music, the pact, and now them as well. "You're bound now," Robert Johnson's voice echoed in the growing darkness. "Bound to the crossroads, bound to the music. The deal is made, and it's yours to carry. No turning back. The youngest man, his heart pounding, felt the weight of those words sink into his chest. He could feel the heavy presence of the shadows closing in, tightening their grip on him. His mind raced, but the words would not come. What could they say? What could they do? They were trapped in a world they didn't understand, with forces far beyond their comprehension. And as the shadows moved closer, as the whispers swirled around them, the truth settled in like a cold, heavy weight. There was no escape. The room seemed to collapse inward, as though time and space were bending and breaking under the pressure of what was happening. The shadows grew darker still, and the whispers intensified, becoming a cacophony of voices, a chorus of the lost souls who had been drawn into the crossroads before them. The very walls of the room felt as though they were alive, their surfaces shifting, rippling, distorting. Robert Johnson remained motionless, his guitar still at his side, but it was clear that he was no longer the same man. He had become something else, something otherworldly, something transcendent. The way he stood, unmoving yet present in a way that defied reason, gave the sense that he was no longer truly part of the world. He was a conduit for something much larger, much older. The youngest man, still struggling to make sense of it all, glanced at the other two. They were just as lost, their faces pale, their bodies trembling. There was no way to escape, no way to make sense of what was happening. They had witnessed the impossible, and now they were a part of it. The oldest man, his voice hoarse from fear, finally spoke. "What does it want from us? What do we have to do to break this?" Robert Johnson didn't answer immediately. His eyes, though still the same eyes, now seemed distant, almost vacant. He wasn't looking at the men. He was looking past them, through them, to something beyond their world. "The crossroads don't work like that," he said softly, almost to himself. "There is no breaking it, no escape. You have crossed the threshold, and now you must face the consequences. It was always meant to be this way." The youngest man clenched his fists, frustration and terror welling up inside him. "No, we don't deserve this. We didn't make any deal. We're not part of this." But Robert Johnson's gaze snapped to him, and for a moment the room went cold. The temperature plummeted, and the shadows around them seemed to deepen further, stretching like tendrils toward the men. "You've already made your choice," Robert Johnson said, his voice quiet but filled with an unshakable finality. "It's not about what you want. It's about what has always been. The crossroads claim what is theirs, and it is only a matter of time before they come for you." The young man's heart thudded painfully in his chest. He tried to push back, to deny it, but he knew deep down that there was no fighting it. Whatever this force was, it was beyond them. It was ancient, relentless, and it had already claimed Robert Johnson. And now it had claimed them too. Suddenly, the figure in the shadows moved forward, stepping into the dim light of the room. Its form was impossibly tall, towering over the three men. Its face remained hidden in shadow, but its presence was undeniable. The men could feel the weight of its stare, even though they couldn't see its eyes. The figure raised its hand, and the shadows in the room surged, swirling around them like a storm. The whispers rose to a deafening crescendo, and the men felt their bodies freezing, as if the very air around them had become solid. The figure's voice, deep and otherworldly, broke through the madness. "You are not the first to be called, and you won't be the last. The crossroads claim all who come, all who seek." The young man fell to his knees, his mind racing. What could they do? They had no power here. The figure, the shadows, the music, they were all a force that was beyond them. There was no escaping it. "Robert," the man whispered, looking up at the guitarist, "how did you survive this? Did you ever escape?" Robert Johnson's gaze never wavered, but his lips curved into a faint, almost sad smile. "I didn't survive. None of us do. We're all part of it now, part of the crossroads. The price is paid in full." The room seemed to close in around them, and the figure's form grew larger, engulfing the men in its darkness. The whispers crescendoed louder and louder until they were the only sound in the world. The walls seemed to collapse around them, and the very air itself seemed to press them down into the earth. They were trapped, bound to the crossroads, just as Robert Johnson had been. They had entered this place, and now there was no leaving. The deal was made, and they too would become part of the legend, part of the story that would echo through the ages. The shadows continued to stretch and warp around them like something alive, something that existed outside of time. The air had thickened further, pulling them deeper into a reality that was no longer their own. The walls seemed to flicker like a broken television screen, and the whispers, those terrible, maddening whispers, pounded against their skulls. For a moment, everything went still. The room went dark, as if the very light in the space had been snuffed out by the oppressive weight of the presence they were now surrounded by. Robert Johnson stood in the center of it all, his guitar in hand, his face now a hollow mask. The light no longer touched him. He was a part of the darkness now, whether he wanted to be or not. The deal had taken him long ago, and there was no escape. He had become the very thing he had feared. The crossroads had claimed him, just as it had claimed so many others before him. The figure in the shadows moved once more, stepping closer to the three men. The whispers died down, replaced by a low, eerie hum, vibrating through the very bones of their bodies. The air was so thick with power that it felt as if it might collapse under its weight. "You have felt the pull of the crossroads," the figure spoke, its voice a deep, resonant growl. "Now you will understand what it means to truly be bound, what it means to be claimed." And with those words, the room seemed to dissolve completely. The men felt their bodies being torn from the physical world, pulled into something else. The shadows swallowed them whole, and in that moment they ceased to exist as they once had. They were no longer part of the world of the living. They had crossed over.